Thank you so much for joining us here today on our webinar. Today, the Vice Chair of the Appraiser Qualifications Board, John Ryan, will be summarizing the proposed changes to the real property appraiser qualifications criteria based on what is currently in the first exposure draft. John, would you like to introduce yourself, and then I'll introduce myself real quickly.
Sure, Lisa. Again, my name's John Ryan. I've been on the Appraisal Qualifications Board now for 6 years, Vice Chair. I own and operate an appraisal consulting group out of Newbury, Massachusetts, which is on Boston's North Shore. I've been in the business for 40 plus years. I'm a certified general appraiser and have an appraisal practice that covers a variety of things, including litigation, mass appraisal, and individual fee appraisal support.
Wow, great. Thank you, John. And I'm Lisa Damaris, the Vice President of Appraisal Issues here at the Appraisal Foundation. Prior to coming here last year on a full-time position, I was a residential appraiser for approximately 30 years. All right, now, before we begin, we always start with a few quick housekeeping notes that I'm going to run through. We are recording this webinar, and you should see that post to our website and the YouTube channel in less than approximately 24 hours. And time permitting, at the end of the presentation, we will answer some questions. So to ask a question, you can move your mouse to the bottom of your screen and a menu should appear. And one of those options shows the chat feature. Or you can simply enable the chat feature by using your keyboard shortcut of Alt+H. It's not a bad idea actually to keep your chat box open, as we will provide links and other information to you as this webinar progresses. At the conclusion of the webinar, we'll give you a super quick and brief survey. It's going to pop up, and we hope that you will take just a quick minute to fill it out. It really helps us to improve our webinars. All right, so the agenda for today, we are going to discuss the 3 sections of the proposed changes from the first exposure draft to the real property appraiser qualification criteria. So John and I are going to do our best to explain the proposed changes. Well, actually, John will explain them. I'm just going to ask him questions about that, and also explain the board's rationale for proposing these. The 3 proposed changes, if I can summarize them real quick. The first one, a proposed revision to distance education requirements. This is on page 5. Number 2 is the proposed addition to criteria specific to continuing education. This is on, and the proposed removal of the 50% limitation to non-traditional appraisal experience, and that is on page 10. Note that any of the proposed changes in part reflect the progression of certain technologies influencing our industry. So that's why these changes are being proposed. And as previously stated, time allowing, which we almost always have, John will be answering questions. And finally, like I said, we will conclude with some quick information on you on next steps. So with that, John, you ready? Let's get started here. The first question I have for you, John, is can you tell us why it is that the board is proposing changes to the distance education requirement in the criteria?
Thank you, Lisa. As everyone might have noticed, there has been a great rise in the number of courses being offered via Zoom and other platforms during this pandemic over the past year. The AQB and the Appraisal Subcommittee have worked together to offer relief wherever possible throughout this emergency. We have issued 4 letters, all in the spirit of encouraging flexibility, which started with continuing education and extended to qualifying education. The Appraisal Foundation has received numerous inquiries regarding components of distant education. As distance education went through this unprecedented transformation, we have received lots of positive feedback and encouragement to delve deeper into the allotted flexibilities after this unfortunate pandemic passes. We are now exploring possible proposed changes to the criteria on distance education requirements.
Okay, great. Thanks, John. So let's go ahead and now look at that very first proposed change. Would you be able to explain the different distance education formats, and that being synchronous, asynchronous, and hybrid?
Sure, Lisa. If we'll take a quick moment here to, if you can, uh, take a look at your copy of the exposure draft. If you happen to have it available, I'll give you a few seconds to open it up. But basically, I'd like you to go to page 6 if you have access to the exposure draft. And if you don't, that's fine. We'll just talk you through it. Okay. In this part of the criteria, we have updated the elements which comprise the distance education components. And as Lisa just stated, they fall into 3 categories: synchronous, asynchronous, and hybrid. And again, in the exposure draft, there's a brief explanation of each, which I'll go over with you even more briefly right now. First, synchronous. In synchronous education offerings, the instructor and the students interact simultaneously online, very similar to a phone call, a video chat, a live webinar, or some type of web-based meeting. That's synchronous. Again, very similar to an in-person class, if you want to think of it that way as well. It's live, instant feedback, if you will. An asynchronous education program would be one where the instructor and the student interaction is non-simultaneous. In other words, the students progress at their own pace and follow a structured course content and quiz exam schedule. And then finally, number 3 is what we call a hybrid course. And a hybrid, sometimes also referred to as a blended course, is one where the learning environment provides for both in-person and online interaction. Now that, again, that online interaction may be synchronous or asynchronous. So again, hybrid is a combination of both in-person, the traditional live interaction, and either an online synchronous or asynchronous environment.
Okay. In looking at the exposure draft, I see that the board has added new course approval entities. So can you explain that a little bit more or kind of tell us about that?
Yes, Lisa. The board has added new course approval entities for the delivery of distance education. There are now 3 alternatives. Please note that distance education delivery methods must be reviewed and approved for the purpose of ascertaining proper delivery of course content. Again, distance education delivery methods must be reviewed and approved to make sure there is a proper delivery of the course content. At the present time, most reviews are completed by an AQB approved organization. And that organization historically has been a firm called IDEC, or the International Distance Education Certification Center. And again, the AQB has been relying on IDEC for years to provide this method of reviewing the delivery, not the content itself, but the delivery of the content. Many folks have asked the AQB to consider expanding the number of platform delivery reviewers in order to decrease the cost of the approval process and sometimes to deal with the excessive approval timeframes. Concerns have been raised about the cost of this review process. Again, sometimes the occurrence of excessive approval timeframes and the inherent constraints on course provider innovations and technological advancement. In this section, the alternative sources for approval entities are increased. The AQB is proposing an approval source in section 3D 3A of the criteria. Section 3D 3B is expanded to include the appraisal foundation, which could be accomplished through staff functions.
Okay, thanks for the explanation, John. So now I want to move everybody, like you mentioned, if they have their exposure draft open, to page 7. So John, during the pandemic, we received, many questions on how students can take their exam remotely. Can you explain the proposed changes kind of related to exam proctoring?
Sure, Lisa. During the past year, there have been many questions regarding allowable forms of electronic proctoring. Part E, Section 7 of the criteria allows for remote proctoring of examinations used in qualifying education. We oftentimes refer to qualifying education as QE. So when you hear the term QE, that's qualifying education. The revision to this part of the criteria section further clarifies that remote examination proctoring is a viable option. Examinations are sometimes completed in a separate location from the actual class. At the present time, this is a frequent occurrence due to the pandemic, as well as the significant increase in virtual or remote education.
And John, so along those same lines, I know in the exposure draft, there's a kind of a new term in there that maybe a lot of people aren't familiar with. The term is biometric proctoring. Now, I've heard it used by like colleges and universities who use it for their online classes. Can you kind of explain a little bit more what biometric proctoring means?
Yes, this is kind of a catch-all term for a technology that actually has been around for a while. Obviously, with the emergence of the pandemic and remote courses, also remote exams, we've delved into this in much more detail. So biometric proctoring has been and continues to be an effective form of automated proctoring technology. During the biometric proctoring process, student identity is continually verified through processes such as facial recognition, consistency in keystroke cadence, and the observance of activity in the testing location. Aberrant behavior or activity can readily be observed. The online monitoring features in these various biometric proctoring systems can eliminate the risk due to geographic barriers between the instructor or the proctor and the student. So therefore, we are proposing new language in the criteria to allow remote biometric proctoring. The inclusion of remote proctoring in this section of the criteria further expands on the concept of examinations administered, quote, electronically on a computer workstation that already exists. This is already in the criteria.
Is that the same for like continuing ed and qualifying ed?
Yes, we made sure that we were consistent so that in Part F, Section 6A, we again mentioned that remote and biometric proctoring is acceptable for continuing education, as is the case for qualifying education. So the same for CE as well as QE.
Okay, and since I heard you just mentioned Part F, so let's go ahead and look at Part F. I think that's called the generic education criteria, and it's this part in particular is titled criteria specific to continuing education. So it's on page 8 of the exposure draft. I see that there is a new topic added to this list. Can you tell us more about that?
Sure. This section of the criteria lists allowable topics for continuing education offerings that cover real property related appraisal topics. The topic valuation bias, fair housing, and or equal opportunity has been added as a new topic. Fair housing and equal opportunity concerns in relation to appraisal practice have become more recently pronounced. This revision will highlight this topic as a necessary form of continuing education.
Okay. And then I also see the same addition of this topic to Guide Note 1. Is that correct?
Yes. This guide note displays the modules required in the required core curriculum of the criteria for all licensing levels. As we discussed above, the topic of valuation bias, fair housing, and equal opportunity require emphasis in appraisal practice and is key to qualifying education. Accordingly, within this module, this topic is now being proposed as new topic H.
Okay, thanks for covering all that. Now I'm going to move you on to the final point in the exposure draft. This, so the board I know has gotten comments that certain states believe that there is a clash of the 50% limitation for non-traditional appraisal experience and PREA, the requirements. Can you explain this to us and the proposed removal of this 50% limitation?
Yes, this is an important proposed change. And what the board's doing here is proposing to remove the 50% limitation for non-traditional clients. Why are we doing that? Well, because appraisals completed for the PREA program is considered experience, which is non-traditional. And since PREA allows for 100% experience for the certified residential and licensed residential levels, it's inconsistent with the 50% limitation in the criteria. So this establishes consistency in all experience gained through either traditional experience models or PREA, and illustrates that appraisal experience performed in compliance with USPAP is the essential key in establishing acceptable experience, not some percentage stated as is stated in there now. So again, we're just eliminating that 50% restriction.
And John, they actually didn't. They're. It's just about consistency. They actually don't even relate to one another. PREA and this non-traditional client limitation. Isn't that correct?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Okay. Just wanted to clarify that. Okay.
Thank you.
I see. I'm going back to my exposure draft here. I see that the board has made some changes to or proposed changes to Guide Note 4.
Yes. Guide Note 4 is AQB's guidance for criteria implementation. It presents the requirements for appraisal experience gained through practicum methodology. Revisions here are proposed to remove the 50% limitation on non-traditional client experience as discussed above, and to eliminate unnecessary guidance.
Great. Well, thank you, John. I mean, this is a very small exposure draft, so it didn't take us long to go through that. So thank you for explaining the different elements of that. What we want to do now is we want to see, what you think. Do you have any comments for us? Do you have any questions for us? I'm going to first go through what you can do if you have comments, and then we're going to open us up to questions for you. We encourage you to write your comments to the AQB before April 23rd of this year, 2021. So you can click on the link in the chat box to submit your comments to the AQB, and you can also just email to them to us if you want. The email is aqb@appraisalfoundation.org. The AQB does also accept verbal comments at its virtual public meeting, and that's going to happen this year on Friday, April 30th. You will also see a registration link to that meeting pop up in the chat box. Another method you can use, you can always check on our events page. That's the Appraisal Foundation's events page, and you can register for those meetings. So now, John, do you have any last words before we open it up for questions, or should we just move on to questions?
Sure. I just want to, on behalf of the entire AQB, all the board members, we want to encourage everyone to commit any thoughts or observations you have to writing, and to please submit them to the board. You know, we seriously review and take into consideration everyone's comments. Now, again, I understand, you know, there's no reason for anybody to be shy about submitting these comments. I understand, we understand some people are, so please consider making your comments anonymously if this better suits your comfort level.
Perfect. Great. Well, we'll just take just a quick second here, and then we are going to move on to live questions. Okay, let's see. We already have questions in here, John. It looks like the first one is easy. I'll just answer that. Is what is the comment deadline for the exposure draft? That's April 23rd. So I'll just take that one right off your plate, right off the beginning there, John. Let's see here. The next question we have is, I am an education provider. Does this mean we no longer are required to get IDEC approval for the courses?
Well, again, this is something we're exposing now and proposing. And if we adopt the changes as proposed, IDEC, you know, won't be required.
Okay. Let's see. Why are synchronous courses still paired with asynchronous courses? In our view, synchronous courses are most similar to classroom courses.
Well, both synchronous and asynchronous courses are virtual computer-based education. And we are looking at segmenting the three, asynchronous, synchronous, and hybrid, into separate items on the in our criteria. So we do look at each one of them individually. And yes, while synchronous is similar to live classes, it's not live classes. So again, it's just because we look at it more as a computer-based or virtual-based education format.
Okay, thank you, John. Somebody wants to know when they can expect these changes to be effective in the new criteria. And again, they mean the proposed changes because we still haven't voted on them.
Right. Well, the board is, as Lisa mentioned, will be meeting April 30th. We're still taking comments. We've received a lot of comments, and we hope to receive more. So the board will be meeting in a work session before the public meeting, and at which time we'll review all of the questions and concerns, and possibly make revisions to the proposed exposure draft. So the changes are not going to happen, are highly unlikely to happen, you know, within the next 30 to 90 days. So I can't tell you exactly when they'll take effect, but needless to say, it is a high priority to the board, and will work as expeditiously as possible in getting these changes finalized.
Okay. Somebody would like to know if you can explain how the revised appraisal process for courses is going to work. I have a feeling we don't have that worked out yet, but
Revised, if you're speaking of the CAP approval program, that's still
correct.
that's a separate entity. The only thing that really is subject to change here, again, is the delivery mechanisms. That's really what we're focusing on. And as the exposure draft discusses, in the past, IDEC approval was required. And again, we're proposing that not be the sole source of approving delivery methods here. And again, as Lisa said, this is part of what we're working on now, is to update and revise these approval programs so that they'll meet, you know, the current needs of the industry.
Okay. This may be a similar question. I'm just reading it while you were talking. So if it's the same question, just say same question, Lisa. Assuming approval of the criteria for the new AQB and Appraisal Foundation approval options for delivery methods, When will the application slash standards slash criteria be available for providers in 2021? So I think that's kind of almost the same question you just answered.
Yeah, I can't give you a definitive date at this point, other than, again, we're working on it as expeditiously as possible.
Okay. Will states to require IDEC approval?
Again, states always have the option of having requirements in excess of AQB thresholds. So again, the AQB makes the recommendations for minimum standards and minimum requirements, and again, the states are always have at their option to have standards that exceed our requirements.
Okay. Did the AQB discuss at all the concept around the fact that proctoring of exams, does that impact or worry the AQB about the integrity of those exams?
Well, the AQB is very concerned and continues to be concerned about the integrity of any exam process. However, given the emergence, and we don't think it's going to go away, of remote education, it was important to the AQB that we keep up with current industry standards, and remote proctoring is something that, again, as we said in the prepared comments, has been out there in the wide education world for a long time now. We believe there is sufficient checks and balances in place to ensure the integrity of the exam taking process, and as long as those steps are followed, and we will continue to monitor them no matter what changes we decide to do. But we feel it's important to acknowledge and make available those changes so that education can continue to be delivered in a cost-effective manner.
Okay. Will there still be something similar to the IDEC CDEI for async and sync instructors? I think the CDEI is that
Yeah, that's the certification that the instructors have to take through IDEC. At this point, I don't believe we'll be looking for instructor certification in distance education. But again, that's all part of what we're reviewing now in this exposure draft. But at this time, we're not proposing instructor-specific certification for distance education.
Okay. Let's see, section F3F. Boy, I can't go to that. Can you expand on how this would become a raised issue? I'm not sure what they mean. Let's look real quick. Well, F3. Okay, that is the one where we're adding to the specific criteria specific to continuing education. We are adding valuation bias, fair housing, and equal opportunity as a continuing education requirement. So he has asked, where is this issue coming from? Well, I don't know if we can answer
it's
that,
just a topic that bias has always been out there. That's always been a continuing education topic. And again, what the 7-hour USPAP update course deals with is contemporary issues in the appraisal practice, and the issue of bias obviously has become a more pronounced, more publicly aware. People are more publicly aware of this issue. There's been not only articles in the technical literature, technical being the university environment, but there's also been articles in the general mass media speaking to this as an issue. So the AQB feels it's important, as we would with any contemporary issue, to make sure things like this that affect appraisal practice are reflected in options for continuing education. So that's what basically brought about the more specificity here of bias, this particular type of bias dealing with fair housing and equal opportunity.
And I think you hit a key word there, John. You said an option. So this is not a new course requirement, correct?
That's correct. Correct. It's just one of the many continuing education topics. We get in the CAP approval program, as well as other from other stakeholders. In the 6+ years I've been on the AQB, we regularly get requests for approval for various continuing education topics. And unless those topics fall within the criteria, we're not able to approve them. So, for example, someone may submit a topic dealing with computer technology, maybe the use of spreadsheets. Well, generically, that may be useful, but unless it's tied in with one of the topics in the continuing ed option list, it's something that we're not able to approve for continuing education. So again, this whole issue of bias, we're just putting a little more, the way I like to describe it, is putting a little more meat on the bias bone, if you will, to give folks specific guidance and topic references that they can include, or that can be included in continuing education going forward.
Okay. This goes back to that elimination of the cap on the 50% non-traditional experience. This question is, can you expand on what that means? What is non-traditional experience versus traditional experience?
Yeah, great question.
Yeah.
Traditional experience would be in a situation where the client is someone who actually is using the appraisal service for a specific reason. In other words, there is a specific intended use and an intended user that's being applied in the marketplace. Whereas, and that's what we call traditional. Someone hires an appraiser, or you as an appraiser, and you go out and you provide the service, deliver a product, and get paid and move on to the next assignment. A non-traditional assignment would be one which you might want to think of as a hypothetical assignment. In other words, you don't have a traditional client that is typically paying for the appraisal service. So it may be work done, and this has actually been something that has been around in various forms over the years. Oftentimes, when a state regulatory agency is reviewing a candidate's experience file, they might find it deficient in certain areas, and it may be a challenge for the candidate to find a traditional client to get this particular type of experience. So there has been instances over the years where a state agency will ask the appraiser, or the candidate, if you will, to prepare work product that's AQB compliant, but there is no traditional client, if you will. So it's like a hypothetical environment where you're doing an AQB compliant work, but it's being done for other reasons other than a typical client. So that's the difference there. And what we're proposing is to say that you don't have to have a traditional client to get quality work experience. You can do the work experience. You can develop appraisal reports and develop your work product without having a traditional client, as one would typically think they would have in this environment. So again, it's a means by which the board is attempting to make it more flexible, give candidates more opportunities to demonstrate their appraisal knowledge by doing appraisal work for, again, non-traditional clients.
Thank you for the explanation. I know that's a pretty common question, so that was very good. This question goes to the course delivery mechanism approvals that we've added to that. Someone wants to know, do we need to also highlight in there that states can be approval organizations? Does that need to be in the criteria?
Again, that's something we're looking at as part of the exposure draft. Obviously, the states ultimately have the final say in terms of what they're going to accept. But yeah, there definitely will be obviously involved in the process.
Okay. By allowing the 50% limitation, how can we ensure that the actual traditional experiences will still be in place? No New appraisers need to have actual experience and more education instead of decreasing the experience and education level. Okay, so that's more of a comment. But do you have anything to add on to that, John?
Yeah, again, I just would remind folks that um, the AQB sets the minimum qualifications. We're not defining competency here. A lot of folks get this notion of what a minimally qualified appraiser is versus a competent appraiser in a specific area. We're not saying that someone who just gets their license is ready to go out and tackle a more complex assignment, be it residential or commercial. So again, it's always in the user's appraisal services users' best interest to make sure that whoever they're retaining for providing appraisal services has competency in the area in which they're working.
Okay. This one I've turned to, you don't have to, but I'll read you through it real quick, John. On page 9 of our exposure draft, which is about guide note 1, we've added to the bottom there on line 106 subtopic, the valuation bias, fair housing, and equal opportunity. And this is in the modules. Does this then mean that this is now required content in all of the basic appraisal principle classes? Or is this, how does that work? How do these subtopics work? Is someone required to do all of them?
Well, generally speaking, we like to see the items in the outline included in the curriculum. But I'll defer to you, Lisa, for any further comment in terms of how specific we are in covering each one of these subtopics.
Yeah, I mean, the subtopics do not have to be covered in complete and in full. Just have a good representation of them. Somebody has said they do not believe we need to have more training on bias. Why don't we educate the public about appraisals? And I think this is probably goes back to our charges of dealing with the public trust. So you want to comment on that at all?
No, I mean, we're obviously committed to promoting the public trust, and again, as I said earlier, this whole area is a if you want to use a cliche, it's a hot topic and one of continuing concern. And if, regardless of how one feels about whether it's legitimate or not, it's in the public domain and it's being discussed. So I think it's just important that we highlight it and make sure we're aware of it, and again, identify it as an acceptable topic to discuss in continuing education.
Great. Well, I have run through all of the questions. I will give people 2 more seconds here. There we go. Of course, I say that, and here they all go again. Related to competency, most lending clients do see the certification as a basic competency, not differentiating. Okay, actually, John, we don't need to address it here because lenders require competency before you accept an assignment, but that's not something that is required in USPAP. So if you haven't. And I think we are good. We have 3 more minutes. If you have any more comments, John.
No, again, I'll just reiterate the board's interest and desire to hear from all stakeholders. And again, there's still plenty of time to submit your comments, your thoughts. And even if you don't have a specific recommendation, questions, comments, you just put your general thoughts of the whole process for this exposure draft is and what we're dealing with. Again, don't be shy about submitting those thoughts.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's asb@appraisalfoundation.org. And we hope you see more comments coming in. I know you guys have quite a few and you've already considered what those have to say about the draft. So I want to thank you all for being here today and have a great day out there.
Thank you.